Hey friend, welcome. I'm so excited to have you here listening to another episode of the Pattern Design Circle podcast. Here we talk all about the ins and outs of designing knit and crochet patterns and running a business that makes it all possible. I'm Jessica, your host, knitting pattern designer, design mentor, and the friend in your ear. Can't wait to dive right in. The Pattern Design Circle podcast is sponsored by the Pattern Design Circle, a membership community for knit and crochet pattern designers that are feeling lost, lonely, or frustrated in their business. It connects you with a supportive community that's always eager to answer your questions and help you through the hard times. And there's loads of resources and activities specifically catered to business and designing. Sound like your jam? Check it out at snickerdoodleknits.com/design-circle. That's snickerdoodle, like the cookie, knits, knits.com/design-circle. All right, let's get into it. I'm so excited that you are back for another episode of the Pattern Design Circle podcast. Today, we are going to be talking all about what to include in your knit or crochet pattern. So in the last episode, we talked all about creating your first design. But of course, once we have this design, even after you've done the math for one size, now you have to figure out how to make this a pattern. So you go from your design idea, the aesthetics, all of those decisions that you've made, and now creating it into something that is replicable, something that other knitters and crocheters can follow to make exactly the same thing. And that's the important part, I think, when we're writing our patterns, is to remember that we need to give our knitters and crocheters all of the information that they need so that they can create the same thing. Because none of us really like surprises, and not turning out right. So the first thing that I think is really important is to pay attention to what you like and what you don't like in other patterns. There really isn't any right or wrong way to do a lot of this stuff. There are some important elements that you need that we'll talk about, but I think it's really valuable to pay attention to how you consume patterns, how you work through them, what makes sense and what doesn't make sense for you. What do you like and what don't you like? What order do you like? So, for example, something that used to really frustrate me about patterns, well, actually, it still does when I work somebody else's pattern and see this, that is when the abbreviations are at the end of the pattern. I get so frustrated because I have to, flip through the whole pattern to get to the abbreviations. I want the abbreviations at the very front where it's super easy for me to find them and refer to them. So that's not the first thing that I did in my patterns is, all right, I want the abbreviations at the front. So think about some of your preferences like that, whether it's formatting, whether it's the way things are worded, things like that. Then you also want to consider your customer. We haven't talked yet on the podcast about your ideal customer. That's a whole big topic. We will definitely cover it at some point later this year. But keep in mind who is going to be working this pattern. What is their skill level? What do they know? What do they not know? What are they going to be learning by working this pattern? What kind of help, supplemental information do they need in order to successfully create this project? If you're creating some sort of really intricate lace design, likely they know the basics of knitting and purling and binding off and casting on, things like that. There are some assumptions that you can make about folks who are choosing to work a very complex pattern. Now, if you're targeting your pattern to beginners, you probably want to make sure you have some additional information in there. You make some things really clear. When you're creating patterns for more advanced knitters, you can make a lot more assumptions and leave out a lot more of the details if you want to. But you don't want to leave that out for the beginner because, at least in my opinion, you don't want to do that because I find that makes it really frustrating and discouraging for that knitter or crocheter. sorry, I'm going to continue to use knitting and knitter as I talk through this because that is what I'm used to, but this completely applies to crocheting as well. Anyway, so we don't want to make these folks so frustrated when they're trying out their first pattern that now they don't want to knit or crochet ever again because it's just confusing and frustrating. I want to encourage them. I want them to feel supported and like they can do this and that they're going to want to work more patterns from you. So consider who you're writing the pattern for. Another part of that is what kind of instructions do they like to use? Do they like to read written instructions? Do they like to have charted instructions? Or do they like to use a combination of both where they can refer to one and if they have questions, they can refer to the other and back and forth? Because for me, I used to be completely a written instructions person. But now I've realized, oh, there are some things that are easier to follow in a chart. So for things like color work and things like that, I actually prefer the chart. But a lot of times I do go back and forth. Even within a pattern, I'll start with the written and then I'll go to the charted for this section and then I'll go back to the written. So I'm the kind of person who wants both. And I have both in my patterns so that folks who like written and folks who like charted have it, and folks who like both have it as well. Alrighty. The next thing is, still around, okay, how much knowledge do they have? Also, how long has it been since they've done a knit stitch or a yarn over or things like that? Do they need to be reminded of things, even if this isn't their first time working it? And what does that look like? Do you need to include specific wording on this is how you work this? This is why we work this. This is, the details step by step. Is that a wording thing? Is that a photo tutorial thing where you show 3 different steps through photos? Or is it a video tutorial that you link in your pattern so that they can watch them? Personally, I prefer both as a consumer and as a designer to have the linked video tutorials because it's something that even if I can't listen to the volume, like with the volume on, I can still watch it and figure out what they're doing as I watch their hands, as a knitter, if I'm confused. And so that's how I like to portray information in my designs. I have linked tutorials to all sorts of different techniques. And then if there's something that I really think is going to be unique for folks who are working the pattern, I'll have linked tutorials throughout the pattern as well. Now, the last thing that I encourage you to think of when you're thinking about your customers is how do they like to go through a pattern? What is really important for them to have and at what point? Now, something that I think is really interesting about ideal customers is a lot of times they are very similar to us. So we like to create for people who are like us. We like to talk to people who are like us. And we tend to attract people who are like us. So it's not like you have to, put a stab in the dark and take a guess. A lot of times you'll kind of create already what you find most useful. It's also helpful to think back to when you were at that stage. So if now you're an advanced knitter, but you're designing for a beginner, think back to when you were a beginner. Think of the patterns or the designs or the techniques that were really helpful for you. What made the process easier and simpler to follow? And on the other hand, what made it really difficult and frustrating? And so how can you support your customers by thinking about how they're navigating through the pattern, what their flow is and what's important to them? Do they need to have different tips and tricks included in the pattern as they're working so that when they get to a certain spot, you say, hey, just a reminder, a tip as you're working through this to make your tension looser or, whatever it is, like for color work. Or is that something that they want to have at the very beginning of the pattern? So they have all of the information before they start and then they follow through the directions. All right. So that's a bit on what I think is really important to consider when you're considering what you like as a knitter or crocheter and what your customer likes. And those are both very important as you put together your pattern template. Now, also, these aren't things that you're going to be reconfiguring every time you write a pattern. Create a pattern template that you're going to follow every time. So that makes your life easier as a designer, because as you're writing your patterns, you don't have to decide, all right, am I going to do this or am I going to do that? Does this come first or does that come first? You already have it all put together exactly how you want it, and you follow that structure. It also makes it really nice for your customers because they know exactly what to expect when they're going to work your pattern. They know, all right, the abbreviations are going to be on this page. The pattern description is going to be on this page. I know that any tutorials that I need are going to be here, and charts are here, written instructions are here, that kind of thing. They know exactly what to expect. And it makes it easier for them to then want to buy from you when they've worked a pattern, know that they love it, and know that if they buy another one, it's going to be the same structure, it's going to be the same layout, and it's going to be something that they really love to make and love to work from, love to follow. So that is very, very important. It will save you so much time and energy, and even just decision fatigue by having a template that you then follow. Also, if you aren't familiar with style guides or style sheets, that is really valuable as well. That outlines exactly what you're going to, how you're going to write out your pattern. Things like how do you word repeats and abbreviations. You can just have all of your abbreviations listed in a document, and then you can pull from that so that it's always the same abbreviation description in all of your patterns. And you can ask for help from your tech editor to create this style sheet if you'd like. It just creates so much more consistency between all of your patterns, which makes it easier for you to create the patterns. And again, it makes it easier for consumers who are wanting to knit more than one or crochet more than one of your patterns. All right, now let's get into the actual, what I consider the key features of pattern. Like I mentioned at the beginning, the important thing about writing a pattern is that you want somebody else to be able to follow the pattern exactly how you have, as you have it written, and create exactly the same thing that you created. So there's no confusion about, does this go this way or does that go that way? Is this a leg or is this an arm? Like for a stuffed animal or something. You want it to be very, very clear. Now, again, it depends what level your knitters are as to how clear you need to be. Do you need to say, this is a knit stitch and this is a purl stitch, and this is how you work them? Or is it more, this is how you seam, this is how you bind up, this is how you block, different things like that. So this of creating patterns that have clear, easy to understand instructions, a lot of that will come with experience. It will come with time. You'll get more used to how to make clear patterns. It also will be extremely helpful to work with tech editors and test knitters to help you decide if what you're writing is actually clear or not. That feedback is so valuable, and it will help you with all of your patterns down the line as well. If you haven't listened to my episodes on a designer's guide to tech editing and a designer's guide to test knitting, I definitely recommend you give those a listen, because those are very valuable parts to writing a clear pattern. But you do have to have the pattern written before you can send it to a tech editor and test knitters. Another part that is kind of interesting as you're thinking about how do I create a clear, easy to understand pattern is it better to have a longer, lengthier pattern that has more description in it, or is it better to have it more concise? And that really comes back to who your customers are. What kind of customers are you trying to work with? Are you looking for the folks? Are you wanting to cater to the folks that need a lot of detail? that want to know all of the details about, this is why I'm using this kind of yarn, this is why I'm using this kind of stitch, this is helping this part of the design not curl, this is, maybe your ideal customer is very inquisitive and wants to understand the ins and outs of how this works. And if that's something you love to talk about, maybe that's something you want to include in your pattern. Now, if it's somebody who's like, I don't care about all of that information, I just want to make this pattern, probably something more concise is more valuable to that knitter. So keep that in mind also as you're choosing how you want your pattern to be worked. And this still comes back again to what is more clear, a written instruction or a video tutorial. Video tutorials are getting more and more popular, and I think we're going to see more and more patterns that are strictly on video and not even written, and that's okay. Consider what you like, what you enjoy, what you find valuable as a knitter, and what you prefer to create as a designer, while also considering what your ideal customer would enjoy. So everything now that I'm going to share is going to be specific to patterns that are written. This isn't, well, I guess you can consider quite a bit of this also in a video. You'll still want to give some of this information, but the format that I'm sharing it in is specifically for written patterns. All right. Like I keep saying, this is all about allowing somebody else or giving somebody else the tools that they need to create exactly the same thing that you created. Because they've seen your photo, they're oohing and ahhing over it, and they want to have that thing for themselves. So how are you going to get that information to them? What kind of information do they need in order to create that? Have you ever, or when you were an early knitter, or crocheter, did you ever just pick up yarn and needles and a pattern and start working? And you didn't know anything about gauge, or you didn't understand it, so you kind of just ignored it? That was me. Details like that are important to actually create the thing that you want to create. So it's not just about the step-by-step instructions of knit 3, purl 2 to the end of the round for 5 rounds, and then knit stockinette for 8 rounds, and then knit garter for 2 rounds, and then bind off. I just totally made that up. But we do have to have more information than just those instructions. And I already hinted at it. Something that's really important to know about is the yarn information. So when you're creating a pattern, make sure you include all of the information that your knitters and crocheters are going to need in order to create the right look to their pattern, or not necessarily right, but to replicate what you have created. So when you're thinking about yarn information, include the fiber content. Fiber content is really important. And your knitter and crocheter can decide if they want to use something else. You can also include tips on what works well for the kind of drape you're creating, or if they want more or less drape, these are the other kinds of fiber content that they can use. But include the fiber content. So for example, 100% acrylic or 20% polyester, 20% polyester, 80% merino wool. Just different combinations like that. That is all on the yarn ball band, and will be a really important piece of information for folks who are wanting to make your design. Now, also make sure you include the weight of the yarn, the amount that they're going to need of the yarn. So that is the weight and the yardage. So weight is grams and ounces, and then length is yardage and yards and meters. Typically, we see this as grams for the weight and include both yards and meters for the length. That also will help folks if they're trying to create a substitute, find a yarn that is similar, and will make sure that they have the right amount of yarn so they don't run out of yarn mid-project. Just a little note in here is that from my experience working with tech editors, the standard for the industry is to include an extra 10% on what you used for yarn. So when you're giving your yarn recommendations, add 10% for folks that might use more yarn than you do. Something else that I like to include with the yarn information, particularly if I worked on a collaboration, receiving yarn support for it, which, by the way, if you're interested in working with yarn dyers, I have an episode for that too. It's all about collaborating with yarn dyers as a designer. But something that I like to do is to link to their website in my pattern when I mention their yarn. So I just have a simple link when I say what yarn I used. I just link to it. So if that's something you want to use, feel free to go ahead and use it too. All right, so we have our yarn, and obviously the other important part is the needles. The needle material, wood versus metal, is often such a personal preference that we don't typically see that inside of the patterns. What we do see is folks recommending straight needles versus circular needles. If you're knitting something flat, that's smaller, like say a dishcloth, typically you recommend straight needles. If you're working something like a sock that needs to be worked in the round, you definitely want to recommend circular needles. And then things like shawls that are worked flat, we often recommend long circular needles for that, so that the weight is left on the table and not bunched up on long straight needles. So when you're talking about needles, the information that your knitter and crocheter or crocheter needs is the size. So say US 0/2.0 millimeter needles, that is the size. And if you have folks who might be working it that are in the US and folks that might be working it that are outside of the US, definitely include both the US sizing and the metric sizing. So like I just said, that's like US 0/2.0 millimeter needles. The length is important because, especially for newer knitters and crocheters that might be buying needles, they want to make sure that their needles are long enough. If you're working a large shawl, you don't want to be working on 12-inch circular needles. So give your recommended needle length for the project. And then this conversation of yarn and needles, we also must talk about gauge. Now, gauge, of course, is something that is often overlooked and not necessarily appreciated by knitters and crocheters, but it is the only way somebody is going to be able to create something exactly like the one you created. And that is because that's how the math works. If somebody is off gauge, it's going to be smaller or bigger than what you've created. So you need to include the gauge information. That is the stitches per inch or stitches per 4 inches typically, 4 inches or 10 centimeters, and the rounds or rows in 4 inches or 10 centimeters. That information is very, very, very important, even if knitters might tend to glaze it over. So you want to include the gauge information, stitches, and either rounds or rows per 4 inches, and make sure you share what pattern that's in. Is that in stockinette? Is that in garter? Is that in the colorwork pattern that you have in the pattern? What do they need to work to get that gauge? And something that I think is really valuable, something that my tack editors have encouraged me to do, is to say when you're listing the needle information, list the information, but then say or size needed to obtain gauge. Because if they're not getting gauge, You don't want them working with that needle size. You want them to work with the needle size that gets them the gauge so that they create the size that they want. All right, now something else, this comes back to who is your ideal customer, who's going to be working this design, is any other information you need to provide around gauge. Do you need to tell them what gauge is and why it's important? Do you need to explicitly write out the instructions that they need to follow for their gauge swatch? Also remember to tell them, is this unblocked or blocked gauge? Alrighty. Now, the last thing that is super important in order for somebody to create the project that they love is sizing information. So once they have the gauge information, and they've gotten gauge, they will be able to get the correct size for the pattern. But how do they know which size that they need? You have to give that information to them. So you have to tell them dimensions of each size that you've included in this pattern. Even if you only have one size, give those dimensions. So if it's a blanket, give length and width. If it's a shawl, give width and depth. If it's a pullover, you probably want to include several different points for sizing information, like chest circumference or bust circumference. You might have a shoulder width. You probably have a length. You might have a sleeve length. You might want to include hip circumference and waist circumference. All of this information is important for determining if this pullover is going to fit me. So think about when you are choosing a pattern, you're trying to decide if you're going to make it or not. What information do you look for? And if you're going to modify a pattern, what information do you need in order to be able to modify it? So if I know beforehand that this pullover is going to fit my chest and my hips, but is not going to fit my waist, I'm going to want to know that information ahead of time so that I can modify that section to make it fit me. So make sure you give all of the sizing information that your knitter or crocheter is going to need in order to make a project that they love. In that, you might have a chart with all of those numbers for each size. You might just list it out, but you also probably want a schematic. And the schematic will tell exactly what each of those dimensions are. So you might label them as A, B, C, D, E. You might label them as bust circumference, hip circumference, waist circumference, etc. But on the schematic, then, you will show what each of those dimensions are and what they refer to. So when somebody's reading these numbers, they know what they're looking at. They also then know how to measure it on themselves or somebody else to make sure it's going to fit. All right, so that's my whole section on creating a project that they're actually going to like the size of, to actually create the project that looks like yours. Now, a couple other things that are really important are, one, abbreviations. Always, 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 always include the abbreviations list. Like I said, I like to have that at the front. A lot of folks like to have it at the end. That's your preference, but make sure it's in there. Don't assume that they're going to know what a yarn over is, or what a slip stitch is, or what a SK2P is. Give them the information so they know how to actually do that. Because the reason we want to abbreviate those things in our pattern is to make the pattern shorter and easier to read, because we're not going to have nearly as many long words there. But the trade-off then is you have to give them a key to know what you're actually saying. It's like unlocking the code. And so that is very important for them to be able to actually work the pattern. Now, I like to, in the abbreviations section, I like to link to my tutorials for each of the different stitch techniques so that they can click the tutorial if they're not familiar. Also, I will say here, definitely feel free to consult your tech editor for information to make sure that your abbreviation descriptions are really clear and easy to understand. One more thing to say here is that you can go to the Craft Yarn Council to see what the typical abbreviations are and get an idea of how you might want to show that. But you likely want to add a little bit more information than what they give. They just, I think, say what it is as far as like the name of it. I don't think they actually tell you how to work that. So definitely recommend in your abbreviations, explain how those are worked. Don't just say SK2P is a slip, knit to pass, because that's not going to be super helpful for somebody who doesn't understand what that means. Okay, now also consider any supplementary information your knitter or crocheter may need. What questions might they have as they're working through your pattern? Are they going to be wondering, is this the way? Am I doing this right? Is this the right way, or am I supposed to be doing it the opposite way? Think about the things that they might have questions about, and make sure that you provide the information to answer their question before they have to ask you. That's going to reduce so many of your questions that you might get for pattern support. It's also going to make the experience a lot more enjoyable for them as a knitter or crocheter. Also, make sure you include design sample photos. So if somebody prints the pattern, they remember what the pattern's for, or so they can see how it fits on you or the model. And so as they're working through the instructions, they can take a look at the sample photo and say, oh yeah, it definitely has to be this way. When you're thinking about different photos to include, you may also want to include close-up photos of different textures and areas that they might want to be referencing to make sure that they're doing it correctly. All right, and the last thing under supplementary information, I just mentioned it a little bit ago when I was talking about sizing, but schematics. The schematics are going to show how your sizing information applies to the knitter or crocheter so that they can select the correct size. It's going to help show them the fit of the object. And you may have schematics that show blocking information. So for example, like the kite shape shawl, it's often blocked into a little bit different shape than is created when you just work it, when you just knit it. So a blocking schematic, you can show the before shape, what it actually looks like after they've made it, and then you can show the after shape to how that it's blocked out to create the correct shape. All right, that's almost everything. A few other things that I want you to remember are, if you have charted instructions, make sure you remember to include the key for those charts. Make sure you have your pattern name on the pattern. And I recommend to have the pattern name on every page of the pattern. And then last but not least, include your name on the pattern, or your design name, whatever you prefer to go with it by. But so then they know, all right, this was this pattern from this person. I can go look it up if I need to. I can contact this person if I need to. So include your contact information. Let them know how you prefer to be contacted. Do you prefer to be contacted on Instagram or on email or by text or in this Facebook group? And as a bonus, if you'd like, you can include some information about yourself. You can introduce yourself, tell them about you as a designer, and let them know how they can support you with other patterns. That's just a bonus, though. That's not necessarily required. So just as a quick recap, as you're choosing how to lay out your pattern, what to include in your pattern, keep in mind what you like, what you don't like about working through other folks' patterns. Keep in mind your ideal customer. Where are they? What do they need? What makes the most sense to them? And then include those key features. The clear, easy to understand instructions, possibly tutorials or photos, all of the information that they need in order to create exactly the same project. So that is all of the yarn information, needle information, gauge information, and sizing information. And then don't forget the abbreviations. Don't forget your photos of your sample. Also, another thing on the sample photos, make sure you say what size it is. And if somebody's wearing it, like for a pullover, say the size of the model or the person wearing it so that they get an idea of how it's actually fitting. And then include schematics. And don't forget keys for your charts, the pattern name, and your name and contact information. All right. That's it. There really isn't a whole lot that you have to include. A lot of it is personal preference, and a lot of it just comes down to how can I make this as easy and clear for somebody else to make as possible? And how do I make sure that it's going to look like mine? All right. I hope you have so much fun writing up your pattern. A lot of times this can be the stage that designers get really frustrated in, can feel really monotonous. You can have somebody else write the pattern for you if you'd like. But if you have any other questions, of course, always feel free to reach out to me on Instagram at Pattern Design Circle. I do also have a blog about this on my blog, snickerdoodlenets.com/blog. That's snickerdoodle like the cookie, knits.com/blog. And if you go into the designer section, you'll be able to find this farther down on the list. And I can also link that in the description. But happy pattern writing, and I'll talk to you again shortly. Wow, thanks so much for listening to this episode. If you found it valuable, please share the podcast with a designer friend. And if you have a minute, leave a review. It's so helpful for me and means the world to me. Chat soon.